As community creators, I find we are often tasked with holding great contradiction in both of our hands. On the one hand, in this episode, we talk about how can we really truly create spaces where people can be honest and vulnerable, even when life is not going their way and maybe they are down in the doldrums. And on the other hand, how do we protect the culture and the vibe of the community to make sure that it remains a space where our members feel a little bit lighter at the end of the day? And how do we reconcile those two things? I was so pleased to bring Mallory Contois onto this episode to help us extract some of this seeming contradiction. And to those paying attention, and I hope you'll listen all the way to the end, because at the very end, we talk about a unique channel in Mallory's community. I think it's yell in all caps. And that bit of the conversation really brought this entire episode full circle. You'll hear a lot of examples of how Mallory provides a lot of structure up front in the community, but then ultimately creates really spacious places for people to show up exactly as they are. So I hope you will listen all the way to the end on this one. It was a fabulous conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Dear Bree, an advice column for community conundrums, fiascos, and drama. This season of Dear Bree is sponsored by our friends over at Heartbeat. Heartbeat is an all-in-one community platform, and it's the one I chose to host my own community. Your members can finally have events, conversation, content, and even courses in one distraction-free, intimate, customized home. I chose Heartbeat for 3 reasons. First, Heartbeat is unparalleled in their events management features. Events are a core part of my community architecture, and their features make my life so much easier. Second is segmentation. It's super easy to break my community into smaller, more niche subgroups and create a more customized experience for that group in Heartbeat. And finally, their courses. Being able to host my educational materials and learning journey in a community-first platform makes my community that much more valuable and retention that much stickier. I'm an affiliate with Heartbeat, which means when you sign up through my link in the show notes, I get paid a small amount at no extra charge to you. Thank you for supporting my work in that way. And finally, I usually record this podcast from Hawaii Island, so a special thank you to the Kanaka Maoli people on whose land I currently reside. Today's letter deals with the nuanced line between keeping your community positive while making space for people to be honest and real about the struggles they are experiencing. And I am so excited to welcome to the podcast the creator of one of my personal favorite communities that I've been a part of, Old Girls Club. It's a virtual community for working women run by none other than Mallory Contois. And with over 1,800 members being run for 2.5 years on Slack, you know that Mallory has seen some shit.
Oh, good to know we can swear.
Don't worry. To introduce Mallory a little bit, she also leads community at Mercury, a bank for ambitious companies. No big deal. She's also an angel investor and advisor to early stage founders, focusing on those building in the consumer, social, art, and creativity, women's health, and marketplace spaces. She previously spent time on the early teams at Pinterest and Cameo, focusing on product-led growth, and as the COO of Medify, a marketplace for gamers to find community and master their skills. So I truly don't actually know how you do all of this without cloning yourself. And secretly, I'm just going to use this episode to fully interrogate you on just how in the world you do all of these things.
That's fine. Let's do it.
She's open. There's consent. Mallory, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. I am such a fan of yours. So this is awesome.
Oh, wonderful. Well, to kick us off, this is a podcast about community conundrums, fiascos, and drama. Do you have any tea from your own experience that you'd be willing to share with us today?
Oh my gosh, the tea. I feel like it's so funny because OGC has been one of the most, and keep in mind, my baseline was gaming before OGC. So that's a community that is like really hard to moderate and like really spicy. When I started OGC, I was like bracing for impact for moderation because I had spent so long thinking about really aggressive moderation of community. And I gotta tell you, senior women that like are, very career oriented are extremely well behaved. And they love a good rule. So it turns out there actually has not been that much tea. There's plenty of tea, but like none that I could share because it's private and specific to things that people share in the space to get people's input on. But I think some of the things or the larger themes that I've seen as I've grown it is really the idea of like, how do you maintain the broader sense of safety for your overall community, safety, inclusion, and psychological safety more so than any other kind of safety. But how do you maintain that sense of that while also encouraging people to be open and authentic and share openly with each other and trust each other and that sort of thing? And there are topics that get really challenging. OGC is focused specifically on working women and women who really identify with their careers. And that's a big part of their identity. And so the primary focus is really like, how do we create a safe space for that group of women and non-binary people on the internet where they can talk about work, but they can also talk about personal things because work and personal blend so much for women in particular, I think, with balancing their home lives and their families and their relationships and how that interacts with their careers. But there are things like politics, like religion, all the basic don't talk about it on your first date topics that come up. And it's a really difficult decision of how to moderate those things, right? Because most of the time when people are bringing those things up, it's because they respect the other women and non-binary people in the community and want to have like intelligent, thoughtful conversations about them with other intelligent, thoughtful people. And it's not because they want to other people or they want to like convert anybody or anything like that. But as a society, I think we have developed such a sense of visceral reaction when those topics come up that it can affect the vibe. And the vibe is so important when it comes particularly to a virtual community where you're not seeing each other's faces. Vibe shifts can happen overnight and it can really sour a community. And so I went through a period this year, particularly with the upcoming election and the Israel-Gaza conflict and all of that, where I had to really spend some time thinking about what the policy was and what the guiding principles were of the community when it came to those sorts of things. And to be clear, I don't think I figured it out, but the things that I did figure out were that the thing that I prioritized above everything else was maintaining a safe space for working women and a place that they felt always safe logging into and like they always belonged there. And no matter how you slice it, things like politics, things like religion can be very partisan, regardless of whether you're trying to have a thoughtful and insightful conversation. And there are so many other places on the internet that you can have those conversations and are built for those conversations. And so OGC can't be everything. And that was something that I had to come to terms with this year. And it can't be everything. And so my decision was really to enforce that basically nonpartisan line of the only things that are off limits here really are these kind of like very partisan, very sided types of conversations. That being said, I did set up a private channel for politics as a test because who am I? I don't know. Maybe there is a way to have a truly nonpartisan, thoughtful space about something that is so important. And I do want to encourage women to be able to talk to each other about. And so my solution for now, at least, is there's a private channel that people have to request to join. So they can't stumble upon it. And they join knowing that it's a conversation about politics and about all the things that come with it. So that's the tea right now is that's happening in private and we're testing out what that may or may not look like. And whether it's the election, whether it's politics, whether it's conflict, whether it's whatever else that comes up, I think I'm really grateful that we're running that test and it might end up with saying, you know what? Nope, like these vibes just aren't good and they need to go somewhere else on the internet. And I'm sorry. Or it might be, you know what? I really think we can structure this in a way where we can empower these conversations. And I'm not quite sure where we'll land yet.
Wow. Yeah, that's really good. And I think especially for online communities, I think there's just like a kind of coming to terms with our own limitations and mortality around, especially like those, like the hottest, spiciest, most triggering. All of our heart palpitations start going no matter who you are and what side of the political spectrum you're on, where there's just a limitation to what can be facilitated online. And there might just be a coming to terms with what needs to happen in person. That was like one thing that came to me was like, this might just be a conversation that can really only be productively held. I don't want to say only productively held, but I think there's just a recognition of the limitations of an online relationship.
Yeah. That being said, I am still so optimistic about, I would love to see a future where we can de-escalate and have like rational, bipartisan conversations about these sorts of things, especially because they are so important. And I do think that like the conversations are critical, right? The sharing of opinions and the sharing of perspectives and understanding why other people believe what they believe. I would love to see more of that in the world. In my mind, though, that's just like a whole other community, right? It's just a different space. And so I think bringing it back to anyone who's listening who builds community or is in the community space, I just think that one of the learnings that I'm still growing into is really getting clear on what the purpose of your community is and what it needs to feel like, and not wavering on that as much as you want it to be everything. It just can't. I would love for somebody to start that community where people are showing up to have rational, level-headed political conversations. I'm just not sure that OGC is like the right solution for that.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's a picture of a really good balance of like really protecting your community and doing the work to understand what it is and staying really committed to that purpose. While I also hear you like approach this with a lot of curiosity and openness and let's do a test and let's see how it goes.
Yeah, who knows? I'm just one person.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious, before we dig into our letter, did you get any pushback on that? And how has it been going in the politics channel?
So the earlier version of this was the Israel-Gaza conflict. And it was brought up a few times in the channel, particularly right as it was starting. And it was brought up and people would DM me and say, hey, I'm uncomfortable, especially because a lot of the people who were reaching out were saying like, I just don't feel like I have enough information to have an opinion on this. And I like really want to be supportive, but I'm like, I feel like I'm being put in a weird place. And it just was, and it was something that I was like, okay, I got to give some guidance here. I have to protect this space, but also really, I hear these people who are wanting to be heard and are wanting to express themselves and are wanting to share opportunities to help and all of that. Like all of it was so well intended. And so I did express that I wanted to keep the space very non-partisan and that this issue was a particularly challenging one, given that everyone was still developing their opinions and there were so many other places on the internet that this could be talked about. And that was a really challenging conversation to have with the community. And it was very much a conversation. I think that's the thing I really want to get through is there's no way I didn't know what the right answer was. And I don't think anybody that leads a community really knows the correct way there are no right answers. And so the conversation was more like, what would make you all as a collective whole feel best thinking about this type of stuff? And the consensus was like, if there are people who want to talk about it, they should be able to talk about it, but I shouldn't be forced to listen to it if that's not why I'm here. If I'm here in this space to further my career and feel safe and feel like I'm not being forced to develop opinions on things or whatever it might be, I shouldn't have to be like bombarded with it. So that was the initial trigger for it. And then I think with the election coming shortly after, it's just like the conversation continued. And I think the long-term theme, which de-escalated the conversation, was me, again, having that conversation and saying, listen, my priority is creating a space that we all love, right? And that we all want to protect. And there's so much ugliness on the internet right now. And this needs to remain a space that we can all come to and not be bombarded with that ugliness. And so that's my priority. And that's where kind of the mutual agreement of the community to stay away from those topics that might make people feel othered or left out or in the minority or whatever it might be, because that's antithetical to our goal as a collective whole. So that was how that conversation went. And so I wouldn't say there was so much pushback as everyone was like figuring it out together. I think people had their opinions for sure, which are always welcome and always helpful. And then to your question about the test, how it's going, I'd say it's actually going quite well. I think I've been encouraged by the fact that it's been highly educational. We actually have a lot of people in the community who work in politics and who work in the space and have a much more full understanding of how things work, whether they work in the media or whether they work in politics or in Washington. And so they've actually been really interesting to listen to, reflect on more of the strategies of the election and the implications of certain things and that kind of thing versus the sided politics of it. There's really not been a lot of conversation about who should win or why people are voting for whoever they might be. And it's much more an analysis of trends that are happening or the current state of social media's impact on the election, things like that. So it has been, again, it's kept me very optimistic that there are ways to not fully quote unquote ban these topics, but it's just a complex framing of them where you have to be like, well, it's not about your belief systems. It's about a discussion of some like subset of it. And it's very hard to define. So I'm still doing that work to figure out if it's something that's scalable, but it's been really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. And I just want to set the context for our listener too, because I know there'll be some listeners who run like really small, intimate communities.
Yeah.
And it sounds like your background and also your current experience, though, do you see 1,800 members? We're not talking about a small community where everyone knows everyone. This is a big network. And so as your community scales and grows, you really need to introduce more structure to preserve that vibe and that culture in your community that you want to move forward. I just want to maybe have a little side note to people who have really small communities. If you're listening to this, my advice would be don't rush to put all this like structure in place of fear. Be like, and by the way, no one can talk about politics in the election season.
100%.
I think you're taking a really thoughtful approach to a question that pertains to your community at this scale.
Yeah.
And so there might be different responses. There are different responses to different sizes of community. And I think that this is a really thoughtful one for where you're at.
Yeah. I always tell people that are thinking about virtual community to literally close their eyes and picture themselves in a room with the exact number of people that they're dealing with online. So if it's 18 people, you close your eyes and you picture yourself maybe in somebody's living room. If it's 1,800 people, you picture yourself in a very large auditorium. If it's 50,000 people, you picture yourself in a stadium. And if you need to keep order and keep things moving towards a goal with those different groups of people in those different environments, what do you need to do? So with 18 people, you just need to just chat, right? You just talk about it.
You're just trying to get them to talk.
You know everybody's name. You're just passing out appetizers. You got a cheese board. You're just having conversations. In an auditorium with 1,800 people, you can definitely do some Q&A, right? You can have a presentation maybe. There's got to be like some guiding principles, right? 1,800 people can't just be doing whatever they want. Otherwise, it'll be chaos. And I probably skipped a size in the middle there of 300, right? Where it still can be a comfortable party. There are 300-person weddings, right? Where there don't have to be a ton of rules, but there are like, you got to like tell people what they should and shouldn't do. And then you get to 50,000 people, and that's when there's like security and there's like set ways for people to buy merch and bars and whatever. And so I really do believe that virtual communities follow the exact same steps in terms of like how much structure as you grow you need and what you have to think through.
Yeah. And if you introduce a security team when you're hosting your little community gathering at a coffee shop,
it would be very weird.
Feel a little weird.
Yeah. Very intense. Unless it's something super top secret, which cool. Yeah.
Hey, maybe work with it. Amazing. That's such a good note. Mallory, are you ready for the letter I have prepared for you today?
I'm so ready.
Dear Bree, as a community leader, I think it's quite easy to remember some of the hardest moments in our careers, the ones that really made us question what to do next. Here's one I'm still thinking about. There was a member of my community who was really struggling in life. They were dealing with a lot of unknowns about their health and were overwhelmed with their workload and spontaneous calls from their boss. They took pretty much every opportunity they could to complain to other community members. Several members reached out to let us know how draining it was for them and how uncomfortable they felt trying to weasel their way out of the conversation. One member mentioned feeling trapped by meeting this person for the first time and being on the receiving end. The main way our community interacts is through online events. So this person was in small breakouts, sharing their negative energy with others and with the big group. It's a tricky thing to navigate when you're in the early stages of building a community. I wanted folks to feel comfortable sharing hard things going on in their lives, but also not become a community built just on positivity all the time. But this was crossing a line. But what line was it? I didn't have a community guideline that addressed this specifically. How would you handle this situation? Signed, Negativity in New York.
Classic New York. Oh wait, we're always the problem.
Have you experienced this before?
Yeah, for sure. It is really hard, especially when you're building this sort of community that's meant to be a support space, right? Especially for people who, if you're doing it, you're creating a space that's needed. And a lot of times when people suddenly find this supportive space, they trauma dump because they've been holding it all in for years sometimes because they haven't had a safe space in a partner or in coworkers or in their family or in their friends to share what's going on. And when they're finally invited to share what's going on, they do it.
Stuff to say. I love that phrase, trauma dump. What to do when your member is trauma dumping in your community.
Totally. No, it's so real. And often I think the biggest piece of advice I would say is just, it's going to sound very obvious, but put yourself in their shoes and go heavy on the empathy here and really try to take a beat and understand their state, right? And like where they're coming from and what is going on and how they're feeling and what the psychology is behind all of it. And then you have to, I think, meet community members where they are and then work with them to make the best outcome. Or to create the best outcome. So I think the things that are key are, I wouldn't recommend necessarily having a community guideline specifically around trauma dumping.
Although, please, be vulnerable, but don't be too needy. It's a fine line.
Well, yeah, it's like a really tough thing. I think it comes more with leading by example and by rewarding good behavior publicly in the community when people do share struggles or challenges in a productive way, publicly acknowledging that they did such a great job of opening up and sharing that, but also being productive about it and taking learnings and like making it useful for the rest of the community. I also think it's like getting really strong in describing what the community is supposed to feel like, because then when you do have a conversation with that person, it becomes a very easy one because you can say, hey, this is what this community is supposed to feel like. If we look at some of the things that you've been doing or the ways, the energy you're bringing to small groups and things like that, that just doesn't feel that way. And it's just not the vibe. And I think it's not necessarily a moment for discipline. It's more of a moment of, hey, like, how can I help you get the resources you need? Or like, how can I help you find other spaces or other people or whoever it is? Or like, how can I help you get what you need from this community faster so that it's not just about repeating yourself. It's about actually a give and take. One value I've found to be helpful is encouraging an equal give and take from every member. And it sounds like this person is taking a lot more than they're giving. And I think that's a very human, easy, golden rule sort of thing for people to understand. So if you have that strong value of, hey, the expectation is that every community member gives about the same as much as they take from this community, it requires a balance from them, right? If they're trauma dumping all the time, they can't possibly give back enough to balance that out. And so instead, they're going to be like, all right, if I need to rebalance this, I'm going to decrease the amount that I'm taking and try to give a little bit more. And that starts to get them a little bit closer to where they need to be. I obviously don't know this person's specific situation. I think there are like versions of this where it's just not a good community member. or not a good fit for the community at that time. And I think that's okay too. And it's one of the hardest things I think that community leaders have to do and acknowledge is that their community is not the right fit for everybody, and really understanding how to have that conversation with people. So yeah, it's a really tough one. I don't think there's an answer, but I think that there's a very human approach to that person's hurting and finding the right way to have a conversation with them about that and helping them find the right solution.
This podcast is sponsored by Ember Consulting, where I'm the founder and head community creator. At Ember, we help people who are familiar with running their business on content, coaching, or consulting become community powered. As you hear in this podcast, creating a community is really tough and managing it can be even harder. So don't do it alone. Whether you're looking to launch a new community or pivot your strategy, our one-on-one consulting helps you skip the learning curve and do it right the first time. And when you're ready to belong to a space just for community creators learning, testing, and growing their communities together, check out the Ember community. Now, back to the episode.
Some great takeaways there. So I heard, just to synthesize this in my mind, the first thing I heard was you went back to this like feeling of the community, which to me drew me back into the values of the community. So like we value helpfulness here or generosity. And so that creates this culture and this vibe of like people, like they'll always be received when they show up here, for example. So I hear starting with that, again, realigning with what the purpose and the values of the community are. Second step is moving into deep empathy with that person, putting yourself in their shoes, and then reconciling those two things and saying, this person is hurting deeply. This is what I know of what they need. And this is the limit of what this community can really be for this person.
Yeah.
And then the third step being to move in to have that conversation and saying like, hey, it seems like these are the needs that I'm discerning and intuiting that you have. And I'm not sure that this community can be all of that for you, but how can I help you like find the tools or spaces where you can get what you need? It might be that you need to take a break from the community. It might also be, we love having you here. We would love to see your generous presence continue here. And we also need to get you some support outside of the community.
Yeah. Sometimes also it's as simple as just giving them a note. Like sometimes people don't realize how they're being perceived. Like I always assume best intent and assume ignorance over malice, where most of the time in my 2.5 years of running a virtual community, just reaching out and saying, hey, I'm sure you didn't mean this way, but this is how this came off. Every time the person has been like, oh my God, thank you for saying that. I totally didn't mean it that way. I'm going to rephrase this. And that's usually what I encourage is, hey, can you just try rephrasing this a little bit for people? And sometimes it's like a diversity and accessibility thing as well. Hey, you might not know that this phrase is like a trigger word for certain groups of people. Or, hey, the way you said this, like for this group of people might not feel that good. And a lot of times they just haven't thought about it. So if I was to give like tactical advice to this person, my first advice would just be like, just if you haven't already, just reach out to that person and say, hey, like I've had a few members reach out and mention that they're feeling this type of way, right? Or they're perceiving that you're really hurting and it's really in all of their conversations with you. I wanted to give you a heads up that you're being perceived that way. Is there a way that I can help you to adjust that? Because sometimes it's as simple as that. Again, when people are trauma dumping after having so much bottled up, they actually don't even have a barometer of what's too much. They don't know. They haven't developed the healthy communication skills around it. And so they may think that people are enjoying it. They may be like, oh my God, this is why people joined this community, is to like help people like me. And that might just be a blind spot for them too. So having a conversation based around that, I think, is a really great first step. And then taking the information you learn from that conversation to decide those next steps of either, oh, this person literally just needed me to say, do a little less versus, oh, this person is like deeply hurting and like really needs other resources in this community. And this is something that I need to be super thoughtful about.
That's really good. And as far as like practical advice, like how would you, a couple notes here, just because I want to get really specific about, we have this specific example. So it's great. We can dig into the detail a little bit. What format would you recommend having that initial conversation, that initial outreach? And two, because other members are like reporting this, I feel I'm putting myself in their shoes. And if the leader of the community came to me and was like, hey, so people are saying that you're a little much. I would be like, oh my God, who's saying that? How many is it? It's probably 1,800 people saying that. Do you mention names? Do you tell the other people how you're addressing it? Because this is a messy one. So I want to dig into the details a little bit. Tell me more.
Yeah. Okay. So I always default to async. So I always default to, and I personally think that if you wouldn't put it in writing, you shouldn't say it anyway. So I have no problem with that. So I'll usually DM them just because I think most people process more challenging conversations asynchronously better. They feel less like it just de-escalates it a bit and brings their heart rate down a little, and it gives them a second to process it and think about it and think about how they want to respond. Obviously, because you're putting it in writing, you have to be super thoughtful. And that's a good editing step as well, where if they were to copy and paste that message and put it on the internet, would you be proud of it? And I think that's a good check for the community leader as well. So I would do that. I would definitely, anytime anybody reports anything to me, I always ask if they're okay with me citing them as somebody who is bringing it to my attention. I usually assume that they wouldn't be. So I use that sort of perspective of, hey, I'm assuming you'd rather me keep this private. But if you've already had a conversation with them or something, let me know if I can mention your name. And I always protect their privacy to the point where I always check usually if I get one report of something, unless it's really egregious, I won't do anything about it until there's 2 or 3, until that person won't be able to figure out who necessarily reported them.
It was. Okay. Yeah.
And then I'll usually say something like, I usually use a couple reports, no matter how many there were, just because I think to your point, that keeps it from feeling like hundreds, but it's more than one where it's a pattern. And so it's the acknowledgement of, hey, more than one person has said this about you or has flagged this to me. I like to use the word flag because it feels a little bit like less intense than like they reported it or whatever. They'll be like, hey, a couple of people have flagged to me. A common one, not a super common one, but one that I see every once in a while, actually way less than I ever expected, is about solicitation. We're like a very much a non-solicitation community where that is not a place to sell yourself or your services. We have one channel where you can promote your services, and like that's the space to do it. But sometimes new members won't totally understand that, and they'll come in and they'll start DMing people who work at certain companies or whatever and be like, hey, like I have this amazing business that like helps companies like yours and whatever. And people report that to me so fast. And so I'll usually reach out to that person and just say, hey, like I've noticed a pattern of a few flags of you reaching out and pitching your services. And again, the assumption is always ignorance, not malice. So I always say something like, it's totally not a big deal if you missed this in the onboarding process. This community is not for selling your services or solicitation. There are so many other places you can do that. This is really a safe space for all of us to be in without getting bombarded with like the sales emails and stuff like that. And I always just say, hey, not a big deal. Just don't do it in the future. And that always pretty much cuts it off.
Good. Okay. That's really helpful. I think that's a really good note about the asynchronous communication, because I think the tougher the situation is, usually the more like the closer I try to be in like an in-person conversation. But I especially love the asynchronous maybe lead in. Maybe eventually it might merit in this situation. It might merit
to offer a call for the record. Like I'm always like, hey, if you want to hop on a call, if you'd rather talk about it, totally down to do that.
It gives
very infrequently does anyone take me up on that. And I also just one other point to make is that I think sometimes we as community leaders feel there's this like parasocial thing that happens where you feel this obligation to be like super relational with people. But the reality is that you're strangers and not everyone wants to have like a deep conversation. It is a bit transactional. And again, this is community to community. Totally depends on your relationship with your community members. But for me, I actually like to create a little bit of space between myself and the community members, particularly at the scale, because I cannot be 1,800 people's closest friend. And so moderation and like having those conversations, the more sort of transactional they can be, honestly, I think the better. And so that comes with de-escalating. It's not personal. It's not about the emotions. It's not about our friendship. It is literally just, hey, you're like a user of this thing. Right. And I'm not, and it is creating those lines and those spaces. I've seen it with people who are having a really hard time. I have said, hey, I'd really encourage you to speak with a therapist, call the crisis helpline, talk to a friend, talk to a family member. You don't have to necessarily say more than that because it's very clearly, we can't be all these things. You don't know us. We don't know you. And there's nothing I'm scared of more than giving somebody like the wrong advice for their context. So,
yep. Oh, I really love that line. I think in my mind, I'm reconciling some of what you're sharing with another episode we did on a toxic community member who's like aggressively like trying to take down the community manager. And I'm like, yeah. So yeah, it's with Andrew Middleton. It's so good. Go listen to it if you're listening because it pairs really nicely with this. But what I'm hearing is like in this specific letter, this person in question is like in a different place. They're not like toxic in that they're trying to take down. They're not like malicious or there's no ill intent as far as we can tell. They're just literally like a hurting, like their hurt is like seeping out into the community in a way that's not necessarily beneficial. And so I hear you sharing, hey, we might need to like be more intentional about our boundaries with this person and keep it more neutral. And in some ways we can do that with asynchronous conversation. Keep it really based on the facts, based on what people have said, not trying to get our like personal opinions or even trying to like, Jay had a great line in her episode about being the support, not the savior. And so I hear you saying that same thing. Put yourself in a position to support. And the second that you put yourself in a position to be a savior, like that is a recipe for disaster long term.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the other thing that really works for just so many of these types of situations is maintaining that expectation of an even balance of give and take from a community from each of your members. And again, that is a really crystal clear thing to explain to somebody. And it is, in my opinion, the core of a successful community. If every member it's never going to be perfect, but if every member is keeping that in the back of their mind of, am I giving as much as I'm taking? That's going to create a really nice equilibrium for you and avoid a lot of these situations. So I would say over communicating that expectation in your onboarding and in any check-ins you do, on any websites that you have, things like that, I think can really help just getting that in the back of people's brains.
Yeah, that's really good. I have one other question I want to pester you about because it relates to the letter and it has to do with something I've seen in OGC, which is pretty unique in my opinion for what I see in communities, which is your anonymous vented out channel. And a lot of community managers are number two, like a vented out. So I think you've provided like a lot of structure and like boundaries, but I also just want to acknowledge you have channels and like create spaces where people can like go all out. And what was behind that decision and like, how is it going?
Yeah, no, I love that question because I do think it has worked so well against my ex that I was not terrified. Well,
I was terrified.
Well, so the thing was that I started this community because I wanted to yell and scream. I was so frustrated and I didn't have a good place to vent. And I also was a psychology major. I'm fascinated with human psychology. And I think we all have that part of ourselves where we just want to scream into the abyss, even if it's something stupid. And I think that humans are going to do what humans do in any space. And the more you can direct them to do those things like correctly or productively, I think the better. So that's also the psychology behind the promote your business channel, where I know you want to. I know you're itching to sell whatever you do. And I love that for you. Get your bag. But if we put it into a channel where people can engage with it if they want to, but avoid it if they want to, fantastic. That's great. Same thing with the yelling caps here channel, where not a lot of members, I'd say maybe 10% of our members have left because they don't want to read people yelling and screaming, which is so fair. 90% of people fucking love it though. It's so relatable. And it is so just, man, every single thing that members yell about in that channel, I have yelled about in my head at some point. And it's so reinforcing and cathartic. It's cathartic for them, but it also it's so good to read because you're like, yeah, like I'm not the only one that's annoyed by this dumb thing. And like you go for yelling. And for the listeners, for some context, it's a channel where people are encouraged to yell in all caps about whatever they feel like they need to yell about that day. And it's really a support, not solutions based channel where it's not about asking for a fix. It's really just about yelling and other people being like, yeah,
that sucks.
Like totally. Like, fuck that person. And it's really mostly just emoji reacts, like of people like hyping that person up or like agreeing or whatever. And it's just a really cathartic place on the internet. And it's pretty clean. Like they're not yelling about anything crazy. Like they're yelling about the everyday shit that like gets to you and you just have to yell about it once and then you're good. And it's been such a great space. And then the anonymous bot is a whole other conversation. And it's crazy because I don't know if you know how it works. I don't even know who posts the anonymous stuff. Like it is like truly anonymous. The only thing I can do is delete a message if it's like out of range. I actually don't think I've ever deleted one though. I think people use it really respectfully. I think people are really grateful to have the capacity or the capability in the channel or in the space to share or to like talk about things that they might be uneasy with. It's everything from interviewing because you don't want your coworkers or your boss to know to infertility or pregnancy when you're before 12 weeks and not ready to share. But you're at 8 weeks and scared shitless and you want some input from people who have been through it before. And I think those situations so outweigh any potential cons, like getting people the support they need in moments of vulnerability or fear to me is so worth any extra moderation that I need to do, which again has been like basically zero. The only con I've seen has really been just like, it obviously dehumanizes it when it's an anonymous bot posting it versus a name and a face. So there are some times where people post things where you probably would have gotten a lot more responses if you had not posted anonymously, and it doesn't seem that sensitive. But for the real sensitive stuff where it's obvious why someone's posting it anonymously, the community really gathers around them and it's really inspiring. So I haven't thought about removing it once since I started it.
It's such a great feature in your community. I yelled in all caps when my transmission died on my van.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
And Mallory, I think it goes back to, I think part of why, and make no mistake, there are community managers that would rather sell their soul than introduce an anonymous bot in their community. They're like, I do not trust these people. There is not enough structure in the world that can prevent me from having to deal with some crazy shit. I think part of the success of that in your community goes back to all of the ways that you've introduced structure and like the appropriate boundaries and reinforced the vibe and the feeling. Because you've put in all that work up front, you created this pretty wide open territory for people to vent it out about anything. And you can even do that anonymously. And because of the work you put in on the front end, that's created such a rich space on the back end.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. It's hard. It's something that takes, again, it's been 2.5 years and I think it's been a natural growth, but it's certainly taken a while to really like catch hold and be super clear and solid like it is now.
Amazing. Well, Mallory, thank you so much for doing this good, hard work of community building. I know my life is better from having Old Girls Club in it. So I'm really excited to see how it continues to evolve and grow. Potentially into the stadium. Excited for that iteration.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know if I might be too old for that. We'll see.
Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you so much for having me. Talk soon.
Thank you so much for sharing some space with me on this episode. Please like and review wherever you find your podcasts. To submit your own community conundrum, fiasco, or other drama, go to the link in the show notes. Aloha and catch you next time.